You're on the mic. And on today's episode, we're gonna be taking a look back and over the next few episodes of On the Mic, we're gonna be taking a look back in time a little bit to some classic cartoon animation studios and just see what happened to them and stuff like that. On today's episode, we're gonna be focusing in on Hanna-Barbera. So, with no further ado, let's get started. Okay, so with that being done and said, so Hanna-Barbera Productions was basically here, I'll just read it verbatim here. Hanna-Barbera Productions Incorporated, also simply known as Hanna-Barbera and variously over the years as HB Enterprises, HB Production Company, and Hanna-Barbera Cartoons, was an American animation studio founded in 1957 by Tom and Jerry creators um, and former Metro Goldwyn Mayer animation directors William Hanna and Joseph Barbera in partnership with film director George Sidney. For 3 decades in the 20th century, it was a prominent presence in American television animation, with a variety of popular animated characters and a succession of cartoon series, including The Huckleberry Hound Show, The Flintstones, The Yogi Bear Show, The Jetsons, Wacky Races, Scooby Doo, Where Are You, and The Smurfs. Its cartoons won 8 Emmys and 7 Oscars, while a star was awarded to Hanna-Barbera on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. The studio was sold to Taft Broadcasting on December 29, 1966. By the mid-1980s, when the profitability of Saturday morning cartoons was eclipsed by weekday afternoon syndication, Hanna-Barbera's fortunes had declined. Turner Broadcasting System purchased the studio from Taft, by then renamed Great American Broadcasting, in late 1991, and used much of its back catalog as programming for Cartoon Network and later Boomerang. Boomerang, originally the classic cartoon channel, now the kind of cast off channel for Cartoon Network series of shows. After Turner purchased the company, Hanna and Barbera continued to serve as creative consultants and mentors. The studio became a subsidiary of Warner Brothers Animation in 1996, following Turner's merger with Time Warner, and was ultimately absorbed into Warner Brothers Animation in 2001, existing in name only. As of 2020, Warner Brothers continues to produce new animation based on Hanna-Barbera's catalog using the Hanna-Barbera brand name. So I'm going to go ahead and go through the history here of it. But this, as I said, now I'm going to go through the history of Hanna-Barbera. I've pre-read these paragraphs, so I'll just give more of a summary here. Um, so starting off, so back in 1939 was when William Hanna and Joseph Barbera initially first met. They met at Metro Goldwyn Mayer Studio, where they became part of Rudolph Ising's animation division. And these were the guys who, of course, um, their first cartoon together was Puss Gets the Boot, which was used as kind of the pilot for Tom and Jerry. Um, and from 1939 through 1957, they would work on many MGM cartoon productions, including Tom and Jerry, Droopy, and a few others that primarily known for their work on Tom and Jerry, and also some of the subsequent works like Spike and Tyke. Um, Having replaced Fred Quimby in 1955 after he retired as producers in charge of the animation department. Um, let's see. They supervised the last 7 shorts of Tex Avery's Droopy, as well as producing Spike and Tyke, as I mentioned earlier. Um, as television was emerging, MGM decided to close the cartoon studio in 1957, um, as they felt they had enough backlog to you know re um, redistribute the redistribute the cartoons, as re-release the cartoons as needed in the television age. That's when during over the next couple of months they would continue working, animating cartoons and stuff like that, and then would be and after basically being rejected by by a studio or two to produce their work, they were approached by director George Sidney, um, in partnership with Screen Gems, which was the television subsidiary of Columbia Pictures, to start producing cartoons for them for like Saturday morning, and it was a coin toss that would give Hanna the precedence in naming the new studio, and then Harry Cohn, the president and head of Columbia Pictures, also bought into it for 18% of the company, and the name of the company was, of course, HB Enterprises. And many of you probably seen that over the years, H-B on some of the closing credits and stuff. And initially, a lot of their work was done through Screen Gems, because this was, these were a lot of. They initially rented offices on a lot where of Kling Studios, formerly Charlie Chaplin Studios, on July 7th, 1957, which is about 2 months after MGM closed their animation studio. Let's see. Sidney and several Screen Gems alumni became members of the studio's board of directors, and much of former MGM animation staff, including animators Carlo Vinci, Kenneth Muse, Lewis Marshall, Michael Law, and Ed Barge, and layout artists Ed Benedict and Richard Bickenbach became new production staff at HB Studios. Hoyt, conductor and composer Hoyt Curtin was put in charge of providing the music. So much of the background music and a lot of the classic cartoons of that time of Hanna-Barbera was done by Hoyt Curtin. And of course, and as they were getting going here, of course, legendary voice actors including Dawes Butler, Don Messick, Julie Bennett, Mel Blanc, um, Howard Morris, John Stevenson, Hal Smith, and Doug Young, all all worked for Hanna Barbera at this time. You know, providing the voices of many of well-known characters that everybody grew up with. So the next section here is 1957, 1969. Funny animals, sitcom families, and more. So, of course, once they got started, one of the first cartoons that they had produced after, for they're one of the first cartoons that they produced for that was a TV original, not a film short. Like a lot of the Tom and Jerry stuff they did were previously film shorts. In other words, they were usually used as kind of intros to movies when you go to the movies. But their first the first cartoon that they had produced exclusively for television was the Rough and Ready show that premiered on NBC in December 1957. Following suit in 1958, of course, was Huckleberry Hound show, which event and on Huckleberry Hound show you had segments that included Huckleberry Hound, Pixie and Dixie, and Mr. Jinx and Yogi Bear. Of course, Yogi Bear would eventually get his own show and become basically the prime figure for a lot of the more anthropomorphic characters of Hanna-Barbera. Um, and then that's how they got started. And um, actually, it was the Huckleberry Hound show that won the first Emmy for Hanna-Barbera Studios. Um, and as time wore on, of course, Joe Ruby and Ken Spears would join as film editors, and while Takamoto would would join on as character designer for Joe Ruby and Ken Spears would eventually go on to start their own animation studio, Ruby Spears Productions. That come later though. Of course, in 1959, HB Enterprises would reincorporate as Hanna-Barbera Productions Inc. And over the next few years, some of the shows that they would start to produce would include the Quick Draw McGraw Show, the theatrical short film series Loopy de Loop, and of course the Flintstones would premiere on ABC in prime time in 1960. It was, of course, some of you may know, the Flintstones was loosely based on the Honeymooners, which is a popular TV show at the time. At one point, Jackie Gleason had considered suing Hanna-Barbera for copyright infringement, but decided not to because he didn't want to be the guy who pulled Fred Flintstone off TV. um, and considering that Flintstones ran, I think they ran for like 6 seasons, I think. Um, they would be the longest running, 6 seasons. They were the longest running animated show American primetime until the Simpsons beat it in 1997. Um, Basically, it was a ratings and merchandising success. Then in 1961, of course, would bring us the Yogi Bear show, which was spun off of the Huckleberry Hound show, along with Top Cat. Um, you also had around that time the debut of the Hanna-Barbera new cartoon series, which featured Wally Gator, Touche Turtle, and Dum Dum, and Lippy the Lion, and Hardy Har Har. Um, Again, a lot Hanna-Barbera, much like Warner Brothers and MGM before them, would be basically be known for a lot of their anthropomorphic characters. Basically, and what I mean by anthropomorphic, basically animals that were giving human characteristics, like the ability to talk or ability to stand on two legs. That's what anthropomorphic means. So, the Jetsons would debut in 1962. Aside from a lot of the animated cartoons and television series they would do, it also do a lot of animated TV commercials, including um, a lot of the work for Pebble cereals um, for Post Company. You know, I'm sure many of you growing up remember seeing a number of commercials over the years of Barney trying to trick Fred out of the Pebble, trick him into giving him the Pebble cereal. Um, and for those of you who remember the show Bewitched, Hanna-Barbera actually produced the animated opening credits for that as well, and those same animations were used later in the Flintstones episode Samantha. Um, in 1963, Hanna-Barbera would move their operations from the Kling lot, then renamed Red Skelton Studios, to 3400 Cahuenga Boulevard West in Hollywood, California. That would basically become their home for the for the next few years. Then in 19, you know, then in 1964, newer programs like the McGilla Gorilla Show, Peter Potamus Show, Johnny Quest, Adam Ant, Secret Squirrel, Sinbad Jr. and his Magic Belt all came about, in 1964 and 1965. Screen Gems and Hanna-Barbera's partnership lasted until 1965 when Hanna-Barbera announced the sale of their studio to Taft Broadcasting. Now, that acquisition was unfortunately delayed a year because, um, feeling undervalued, the remaining members of the Cohn family, um, his wife Joan Perry and his sons John and Harrison, um, Harry Cohn's remaining families felt that the studio was undervalued, or studio undervalued their 18% of the company, and therefore locked it up for a year. Then in 1966, that was the year that the Taft deal was finalized, of course. But aside from that, Hanna-Barbera had produced a Laurel and Hardy animated series, as well as Frankenstein Jr. and the Impossibles and Space Ghost, which first aired in December of 1966. A litigation was settled for like 12 million, or okay, litigation was settled, and the studio was finally acquired by Taft for $12 million. It would fold it into its corporate structure in 1967, 1968, becoming a distributor. Hanna-Barbera stayed on with the studio while Screen Gems retained licensing and distribution rights to the previous Hanna. So those cartoons that Hanna-Barbera had done under Screen Gems retained the licensing and distribution rights to those part, and along with the trademarks to those characters into the 1970s and 80s. 1967 also saw a number of new comedy and action series, including The Space Cadets, The Abbott and Costello cartoon show, Birdman and the Galaxy Trio, Hercules, Shazam, Fantastic Four, Mighty Moby Dick and Mighty Mightor, Samson Goliath, also known as Young Samson. Um, Now, many of these cartoons, of course, that came out like the mid to late '60s, like Frankenstein Jr., Space Ghost, Birdman, and the Galaxy. A lot of they were eventually repackaged in like I think it was 1978 as the one of the versions of the Fantastic World of or the Super Adventures. That's what it was. The Super Adventures repackaged as the Super Adventures. Um, Then in 1968, of course, Hanna-Barbera brought in kind of some shows that were kind of a mix of animation and live action, with the Banana Splits Adventure Hour, the Adventures of Gulliver, and the New Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Um, and also around this time brought about Wacky Races and its eventual spin-offs, The Perils of Penelope Pitstop and Dastardly and Muttley in their Flying Machines, that both aired on CBS, while Chattanooga Cats, which was produced by Barbera at this time, um, had become part of ABC's Saturday morning lineup. The studio had first and only record label had its first and only record label, Hanna-Barbera Records. Okay, so they would do a lot of the previously children's records featuring HP characters were released by Colpix Records. So now around this time, of course, the late '60s into the '70s, Hanna-Barbera was more or less starting to become the major power in the Saturday morning cartoon. Their stuff was all over Saturday mornings. You know, a lot of their main competition was Filmation and Filmation, Warner Brothers, and DePatie Freeling. So, let's see, 1969 and 1979, which brings about the mysteries with comic relief characters, superheroes, and more variety. So, as we get into like '69 and into the '70s here, you're gonna start seeing even more variety among you know more variety among their cartoons. Um, Joe Ruby and Ken Spears were the ones who created Scooby Doo. Where are you? Um, Oftentimes, as the saying goes, often imitated, never duplicated. Right? So Scooby Doo. Where are you? Was basically the forerunner to to as they call it here, mysteries with comic relief characters, or another way we look at it is those meddling kids, right? Because a lot of these series had, and they would combine comedy, action, and elements from I Love a Mystery. Like, of course, the Scooby Doo Where Are You spawned a number of spin offs featuring Scooby Doo and his cast of characters, including the new Scooby Doo movies, Scooby Doo Show, Scooby Doo and Scrappy Doo, and all that. Um, that were that basically went well into the '90s. In fact, even to this day, that you still have newer ones being produced by Warner Brothers, newer variations. Of course, Scooby Doo um, spawned a number of other kind of those meddling kids, mysteries of comic characters, cartoons throughout the '70s, including the musically based one, Josie and the Pussycats, the Funky Phantom, the Amazing Chan and the Chan Clan, Speed Buggy, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kids, Goober and the Ghost Chasers, Inch Eye Private Eye, Clue Club, Jabberjaw, were all kind of these. All these shows were built on the Scooby Doo model. Um, the Flintstones, of course, would also regain, would also spark some newer popularity in 1971 with the premiere of Pebbles and Bam Bam Show, which featured the now teenage versions of the babies from the previous shows, and then you also have other Flintstone TV shows and specials, including the Flintstone Comedy Hour, the new Fred and Barney Show, remaining in production through the '80s. Of course, you also had a number of the Christmas classics as well. Of course, Yogi Bear, Huckleberry Hound, and other anthropomorphic characters were also um, came back in '72 with new productions such as Yogi's Ark Lark, the TV film Yogi's Ark Lark and its spinoff Yogi's Gang, as well as Laugh Olympics, Yogi's Space Race, Galaxy Goof Ups, and then um, Tom and Jerry was also brought back as a new television show in 1975. Then, 1973, we get into um, Hanna-Barbera further getting into the superhero genre. Aside from the Super Adventures as mentioned earlier, now they in 1973 um, they produced the first of several iterations of the Super Friends, which was um, which was the cartoon that I grew up on, and probably many of you grew up on. It was based on many of DC Comics Justice League superhero characters, and of course the 1973 Super Friends TV series, and all the Super Friends series were basically on ABC. Um, and it would spawn a number of sequels and follow-ups, including the all-new Super Friends Hour, Challenge of the Super Friends, which was the main one that also featured many of their arch enemies, the Legion of Doom, um, the world's greatest Super Friends, which would eventually lead into the 80s with super the superpower um, Super Friends, the super legendary superpowers team, and super powers team Galactic Guardians. Those are more in the 80s, though. Also, Hanna-Barbera, some of the other shows that they produced in the 70s, including the Harlem Globetrotters, Help, It's the Hair Bear Bunch, the Roman Holidays, C Lab 2020, Genie. Genie, of course, based on the comedy show, The Addams Family, Partridge Family 2020, These Are the Days, Valley of the Dinosaurs, Wheelie and the Chopper Bunch, CB Bears, All New Popeye Hour, Godzilla, and Jana of the Jungle. Um, Hanna-Barbera also produced the animated film adaptation of E.B. White's children's novel Charlotte's Web. The one that was released in 1973 with Tammy Reynolds, or no, Debbie Reynolds. I'm sorry, Debbie Reynolds, voicing the title character. The reason I said Tammy Reynolds is because of course, she had the big hit Tammy. Um, Basically, by this point, by the late 70s, of course, um, Hanna-Barbera had become the main animation power in America, with again its main competition coming from Filmation and DePatie Freeling, as well as Warner, of course, the Warner Brothers. That was Bugs Bunny and all those characters. But then ABC president Fred Silverman um, ended up giving more of their cartoon time to it after the failure of Filmation's Uncle Croc's block, you know, along with the rest of the America. And then in the 70s, early 80s, they began moving away from producing everything in house. Um, and by I think it was let's see, let's see, Joe Ruby and Ken Spears were also brought in to help develop programs such as Captain Caveman and the Teen Angels and Dynamite Dog Wonder. 1977, though, Joe Ruby and Ken Spears left in 1977 to start Ruby Spears Enterprises, um, with Filmways as its parent company. Um, in 1979, Taft bought World Vision Enterprises, became Hanna-Barbera syndication distributor. Um, you know, they began also producing some live action shows in Man from Atlantis for NBC, and The Gathering, an Emmy award-winning TV movie starring Ed Asner and Maureen Stapleton, written by James Poe and directed by Randall Kleiser, I believe is how you. So now we're getting into the decade of the 80s here. At the beginning of the decade, they would still have a considerable amount of success. But as the 80s wore on and as syndication became more popular, you know, they would start to decline. Probably one of the most notable things that happened was, as they said, Smurf Mania, which we'll get into that in a moment here. So among some of the shows that came out in 1980 would include Super Friends, The Fonz and the Happy Days Gang, Richie Rich, um, the new Scooby Doo and Scrappy Doo episode, Flintstones Comedy Show. Also, Vernon Shirley in the Army, Space Stars, the Corolla Show, and Trollkins aired while Taft bought Ruby Spears from Filmways in 1981. Now, while at this point, while Hanna-Barbera was dominating Saturday morning, Filmation had rebounded a bit here, along with Marvel Sunbow, um, Rankin Bass, and Deke Enterprises would all become forces in the syndication circuit. Um, so these companies were becoming, and as syndication was becoming more popular, Hanna-Barbera was starting to, Hanna-Barbera still dominated, Saturday mornings and somewhat a little less weekday afternoons because they were getting stronger competition on weekday afternoons with the syndication of syndication from Filmation, Marvel, Sunbow, Rankin Bass, and Deke. But by this point, they had significant competition by this point. Now, during this time, of course, they were saying that their control over children's program went down from 80% 20%. Hanna-Barbera, probably the next big success Hanna-Barbera had in the 80s was the Smurfs, which of course debuted in 1980 or 81 and then ran for 8 years. The Smurfs was adapted from the comic by the writer known as Peyo, real name Pierre Culliford, about basically a bunch of little blue creatures who lived in a forest, and they would fight off the likes of Gargamels. Of course, it also spawned a number, 7 Smurf specials, including, of course, the Smurfs and the Magic Flute, and Smurfs Christmas specials, Smurfy Christmas. And then as time went on in the 80s, other shows that were produced by Hanna-Barbera included Joke Book, The Gary Coleman Show, Shirt Tales, Pac-Man, The Little Rascals, Scrappy and Yapadoo, The Dukes, The Munchichis, The New Scooby and Scrappy Doo Show, and The Biscuits. These all came about in 82 and 83. For their international distribution, Hanna-Barbera outsourced their cartoons to Cuckoo's Nest Studios, Mr. Big Cartoons, Mook Company Limited, Toei Animation, and Phil Cartoons for Australia and Asia. Some of the other cartoons that came out in 1984 would include the other shows they produced that came out in 84 would include The New Scooby-Doo Mysteries, Snorks, Challenge of the GoBots, Pink Panther and Sons, and Super Friends, The Legendary Superpower Show. 1985, of course, would bring us Superpowers Team Galactic Guardian, The 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo, along with Yogi's Treasure Hunt, Galtar and Pawpaws. The last 3 shows I mentioned there, Yogi's Treasure Hunt, Galtar and the Golden Land, and the Pawpaws were put together in the package known as The Fantastic World of Hanna-Barbera. and they had, and this was also around the time that newer episodes of the Jetsons had premiered. Now, these were the Jetson episodes that premiered in the 80s. Those were the episodes that introduced us to the character Orbity, the cute little creature who would change colors depending upon his emotions. He had suction cup feet and and springs for legs, where you'd see him stretch down and up and all that. And basically became another pet and competition for attention for Astro. Um, as time moved on, of course, he had the Greatest Adventure, Stories from the Bible, which was the first new straight to video series debuted. Um, in 1986, you had new Johnny Quest episodes. You had Pound Puppies debut, as well as the Flintstone Kids, basically depicting the Flintstones children, Foofer and Wildfire, and along with then Sky Commanders and Popeye and Son debuted in 1987. And by this point, Taft had started to suffer some financial issues, which were beginning to take their effect on Hanna-Barbera. They would eventually be acquired by the American Financial Company, which renamed Taft to Great American Broadcasting. Um, Not to, I don't think that's to be confused with Great American Country, um, cable channel of country music. Also in the late '80s, here you started, in '89 and in '88, '89, you also saw the debuts of A Pup Named Scooby Doo, Completely Mental Misadventures of Ed Grimley, new Yogi Bear episodes, Fantastic Max, The Further Adventures of Super Ted, and Paddington Bear. Around this time, Great American sold World Vision to Aaron Spelling, while Hanna-Barbera and its library remained with them. Um, some of the staff left to help Warner Brothers with their company. Um, David Kirshner, who had produced the film franchises Child's Play and American Tail, was brought in as the new CEO of Hanna-Barbera in 1990. And they'd have another subsidiary that they'd start up at Bedrock Productions. Eventually, Great American would put Hanna-Barbera and Ruby Spears up for sale due to their decline and being burdened by debt. But as this was all going on, of course, some new shows that were debuting around this time include Midnight Patrol Adventures in the Dream Zone, Rick Moranis and Gravedale High, Tom and Jerry Kids Show, and an adaptation of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, as well as the adventures of Don Coyote and Sancho Panda, and Wake, Rattle, and Roll. Then, in 1991 is when we saw Turner get into the act here. As 1991, Turner would eventually Turner would get involved and buy up buy up Hanna-Barbera, and would basically buy up a lot of their properties to use for programming for like Cartoon Network and Boomerang. Among the shows that debuted in '91 included Young Robin Hood, Pirates of Dark Water, and Yo Yogi. And of course, as time went on, Cartoon Network would with many of their own animators, including Pat Ventura, Craig McCracken, Donovan Cook, Gendy Tartakovsky, David Face, Seth MacFarlane, Van Partible, Butch Hartman, and Stuart St. John. In 1992, they were renamed HB Production Company, and they would produce Fish Police and Capital Critters and New Addams Family. And then eventually Turner would, of course, debut their Cartoon Network, the first like 24-hour all Cartoon Network, all animation channel. Um, the studio again named itself Hanna-Barbera Cartoons Incorporated in 1993, albeit many of the shows that were produced prior to 92 would still have the Hanna-Barbera Productions name attached to them. Some of the newer shows that would come out around this time, in the early in like 92, 93, around there, would include Droopy, Master Detective, The New Adventures of Captain Planet, SWAT Cats, The Radical Squadron, and Two Stupid Dogs. In 1994, Turner TBS would refocus the studio to produce new shows exclusively for its networks. And probably one of the last new Hanna-Barbera show to debut on ABC was an adaptation of Dumb and Dumber. From this point on, many of the cartoons that were produced by Hanna-Barbera, which eventually became Cartoon Network Studios, um, were produced more or less exclusively for the Turner cable channels, including What a Cartoon, which originally premiered as world premiere tunes, and of course many of the cartoons that we knew from the late 90s, including Dexter's Laboratory, Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, the Powerpuff Girls, um, as well as Cave Kids and Real Johnny Quest, were done by Hanna-Barbera, and then eventually Turner merged with now by 2001. By 2001, everything was pretty much coming to an end for Hanna-Barbera. A lot of their a lot of their a lot of their properties were eventually bought up by Warner Brothers Animation. Um, as part of the Turner and Time Warner merger. So so now you have situations where now the Warner Animation Group has control of all these, and they're producing their own. They've produced many cartoons in recent years based on the legacy, what they call the legacy franchises, like Scooby Doo, the Flintstones, all that. So that's pretty much the history of Hanna Barbera. They're no longer around, of course, or well, they're still around, but they're survived in Warner Animation. See, I'm trying to, you know, especially considering that, um, basically it was absorbed into Warner Brothers Animation in 2001. So, with that, that's pretty much um, what came of it. William Hanna passed away from throat cancer on March 22nd, 2001. Joseph Barbera died of natural causes December 18th, 2006. And then Iwata Takamoto died of a heart attack. So those who were originally connected to Hanna-Barbera are no longer around. Um, the studio got absorbed into Warner Brothers Animation. And that's pretty much it for the history of Hanna Barbera. So with that, let's take a quick peek at this day in Nietzsche history. Today being May 7th, 2020. So let's take a quick peek at what we can find here. On this date in 1997, 23 years ago, Marvel Comics released on the newsstands the first issue of Alpha Flight, The first issue was titled Alpha Flight in the beginning, and then after that was just simply named Alpha Flight. It ran for 20 issues, but it debuted on this day in 1997. And also on this date in 2000 marked the debut of Kevin Steen, better known to WWE fans as Kevin Owens. Um, he debuted on this date in Le, Le Zor, Azompton, Quebec. After being inspired to wrestle at age 11 after seeing Shawn Michaels and Diesel matchup from WrestleMania 11. He would 3 years later his parents would allow him to train with Sergey Wadwan, a wrestler based in Quebec, where he would eventually begin training with Jacques Rougeau and would eventually start wrestling in the Canadian independent. But he would make his debut on this date 20 years ago. So think about this, folks. Kevin Owens in the WWE right now has been wrestling now for 20 years in total. Is covering of course, his independent work. I know back in the early 2000s he was also in for a while in Pro Wrestling Guerrilla out here in California. So with all that being said, now with all that being said, um, you guys of course can check the links below. If you'd like to contact me directly, you can DM me on my DM me on my Discord. You can check out the Discord and join if you'd like. Also, as you know, I'm still promoting a bunch of different dub companies. I'm also still promoting the GoFundMe's. Um, as always, guys, never feel like you have to donate. If it's on your heart to do so and you have the means to, please consider donating. If you already donated, please consider donating again. And if you cannot donate, you can still help out the cause by sharing the link. Because sharing is caring, and you never know. Maybe there's somebody in your circle of friends who might want to help. And if you like this content, please consider liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. I always look forward to the conversation with you guys as long as it's civil and respectful. I hope you find this video, informative and entertaining, learning about some of your favorite Saturday morning cartoons and when they came out and stuff like that. Um, and I hope I'll see you guys back here for tomorrow. Um, right, I'm leaning towards maybe doing a episode on Saturday morning cartoons in general, the history of that. Also, don't forget tomorrow is also the next premiere of Voices Big and Small, where I'll be talking about Jimmy Zoppi. So until tomorrow, guys. Bye.